Okay, what were those three words that I asked you to remember? Clock. There you go. Boy, y'all are good. That's awesome. That is awesome. Very good. This idea of a grief room came from Bill McDonald, who helped get us started many years ago in the idea of grief. And it's this idea. If your grief would be seen as a room, what size would it be? Would it be as big as this auditorium? Because you're so open about your grief journey that you're willing to share it with anybody and everybody? Or would it be a 2x4 or a 6x10? If your grief was like a room, what would it look like? Now, there's no right way, there's no wrong way, there's just yours. But I'll tell you, more than likely, men's grief rooms are smaller than women's. Why? Well, because we process grief differently. Society often don't allow men to grieve as long as women do. Remember the Rocky movies? I believe it was the second Rocky movie where Mick, his trainer, has a heart attack right before he goes in to fight somebody. And Rocky doesn't want to leave him, and his wife says, I'll stay with Mick. And he goes out and his mind's on something else and he gets beaten to a pulp. But he comes back and Mick is still alive. And Mick asks him how he does, and he lies and he says everything went well and whatever. And then he said, how are you doing? He said, well, I'm going to be all right. I'm going to be all right. And as he's talking, he can tell that he's getting worse. And then all of a sudden he dies. That was one of the first times that Hollywood showed a male actor crying his eyes out. And he's sobbing, and he's moaning, and he's crying loudly. Because it was for one of the first times that Hollywood said it's okay to cry. We don't see John Wayne crying a great deal, right? Or some of those other He-Man. But women can cry for a long, long time, and they will often have people crying with them. But after a while, when a man cries, somebody thinks something's wrong with them. Again, that's not right at all, but that's the idea. Hopefully society has changed some of that. But typically, men's grief rooms are going to be smaller than women's. It's not an actual room, although it may be a room in your home. It may be a place where you sit down and you think about your loss or losses, and that's okay. I have brought to you some pictures of people's grief rooms, because one of the things that I get to do when I go around from place to place is say, if you are willing, draw your grief room, and if you're willing, give it to me, and I'd love to show it to others. And so on this table up here, I'm going to put some of these after we discuss them, and during the break, if you want to come up and take a picture of them, that would be fine, to evaluate maybe your room versus their room. But if you were to have a grief room, first of all, how big would it be? Secondly, what kind of door would you have on your grief room? How open are you to allow people into your life to talk about something precious to you, your grief? Now again, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way, there's your way. Would it be one of those old-timey swinging doors? We just built a new home, and my wife wanted one of those old-timey swinging screen doors to the pantry. And so we found one for $35. And it's right there in the middle of the house, right off the kitchen. And you can just, there's no lock on it. You just open it up, come on in. Or would your door be a metal door? And would it be solid? And would there be a peephole so that you could look through? Because there may be some people that I really don't want into my grief business. And that's okay. And there's others that they can come on in. Now, as you're thinking about your grief room, what kind of doorknob do you have on your grief room? Are the doorknobs on both sides or only on your side? Because you may not want to open that door and allow that person on the other side that you see through the peephole into your grief. Again, not wrong or right, just yours. What kind of locks would you have on your grief door? Would you even have a doorknob on their side so that you're the only one that can open the door and they can't? What kind of locks would you have? Would you have key locks on your grief room? And if so, who would you give keys to that they can come into your grief room and sit with you? How many keys would you give to others? Not a right way, not a wrong way, your way. Understand the point? What about windows? Do you want windows in your grief room? Do you want to be reminded that there is an outside, that there is beauty out there, that life continues out there? Would you like lights to come in? There's lights coming in from back there, even though it's over a cloudy day. Again, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way, there's your way. I want to describe to you and show you some of these. I'll tell you about some of them. In March of 2022, we were in Orlando. And it was the congregation where Jerry Jenkins' brother was at there in Orlando, Concord Road, I believe it's called. Dan Jenkins. And a lady told me during a break, and thank you so much for coming up and telling me your stories. I really appreciate that. She said the sewing room in our house was where I would work. And the living room would be where my husband would sit and watch TV. And we'd talk to each other because it was so close to one another. I could talk from there and hear him. He could talk from there and hear me. But when he died, I just couldn't go into the sewing room any longer. It just felt so distant. And so I decided to move my sewing room into the living room. And that's where I grieve. I can sit there and talk, even though he's not there. And I can grieve, and I can sew, and I can watch TV. And so that's what she did. A friend back in Florence lost his wife of 30 years. And he said, in our bedroom, I have some of her favorite clothes in our closet still. And I can smell her scent. And sometimes I'll spray some of her perfume on my pillow. And so our bedroom is my grief room. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, an elder who lost his wife said, after my wife died, my grief room became the elder's office. Even though I was no longer an elder, those 8 to 10 men would allow me to come. They would share with me. They would cry with me. They would pray and hug with me. And they helped me through some of my toughest days. I thought, wow. Shepherds ministering to shepherds. That's the way it ought to be, right? Or former shepherds, as the case may be. Here's some pictures. And again, I'll put these up here. This lady drew her grief room. There's a big circle where her family sits. But what I like about this are two things. Her grief room goes outside the house. And so over here on the left is a gazebo in the woods. And in that section, her friends will come and talk to her at the gazebo. And then over here in the woods, she writes, where I go to scream and cry and vent my feelings. But what I like about this one, and the one that's circled here, is she has a church bench. And all those X's are church members. And she says, and I mean that in a good way, not a bad way, that she got X's. It's a huge pew. And she said, this is where all my church friends come and sit with me in my grief. Rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that weep, Romans 12:15. And so I love that concept, and that's here. This one's very sad. One year, when I was teaching the 10-week class there in the Florence area, I never know until the first night or the first few nights who's coming. That particular week, the particular year, we had 32 people, probably the most ever, in a 10-week class there in Florence come. And 7 couples were there because of the death due to suicide. I don't know if they had talked or what, but 7 different couples. And we talked about this grief room concept, and this lady and her husband came. And so it's a very sad picture because they're in their garage that they would go to after they ate supper and sit there in their chairs with the hope that people would come to visit them. And you can see their faces are sad because very few neighbors ever came after the funeral. Remember, 97% of friends stopped visiting 2 weeks after the funeral. This was the sad concept of that. Over here is the light post that sometimes came on, and she took it that her son, even though he had died, was coming back and light up that light, and it would just come on for the strangest of reasons. But that was their grief room, and it wasn't a very good one in regards to lack of people there. This lady was an artist, 25 years of age, and so instead of drawing a grief room, she drew a grief forest, and she names the trees. And some of them are death, and some of them are darkness, but others are grace, and others are joy, and others are love. And she says, grief is a desolate field of dead trees yearning to learn to live again. I like that idea. And so, beautiful picture of her grief tree forest, if you will, and what she did. This lady lost a brother who was a song leader in the church. And she said, my grief room is filled with windows and an open door. It welcomes anyone who would like to talk about my brother. Lights are not needed. Memories completely light up the room. Music is abundant in the room. Favorite hymns can be heard at any time. Now, she mentions another part of that grief room, and it's called a pain box. And the basic idea is this: how much pain are you willing to share with your intimate friends? Are you willing for them to see the good, the bad, and the ugly? Or are you willing to only share maybe half of yourself and the pain that you have because of your grief? Again, not a right way, not a wrong way, just your way. She said, my pain box is locked, but 6 people have the keys to my grief room, and others may be made or are waiting to be used at the appropriate time. This lady is somewhat old-fashioned. She's got the old-fashioned telephone that rings, and she has, about 20 friends. And she said, these are all my friends that talk to me regularly. She has a mailbox where people would send her cards. I have a good friend back home that lost her daddy. And she said all the cards of sympathy came the first few weeks, but then they stopped. And then all of a sudden, after the third week, here came a card. And it meant so much because all the others were here and gone. And now somebody 3 weeks removed still thought enough about me to talk about my daddy's death. And Mary Ann now will wait till 3 weeks after a funeral and send you a card. And she does that in memory of her daddy and in honor of that. This one was in 2023, and she draws the family room and the chair that her husband Paul lived in or sat in a great deal. And she says that's in the middle of the room because that provides comfort to us, where we can go and talk about him and feel closer to him in regards to that. This lady in 2023 drew her grief room at the cemetery, and she's sitting beside the grave of her son Bradley, and that's her grief room where she goes. I have an elder friend in Lebanon, Tennessee, who has lost his parents, has lost, I know, at least one brother, maybe two brothers, but then also lost a daughter after 30 plus years of marriage, or of living, I should say. She never married. And he says, my grief room are cemeteries. I'm retired, was a milk farmer. I now have time on my hands. People know that I like to go to cemeteries, and so they'll ask me to look up family members. And I'll go to investigate and try to find those cemeteries or those markers so that I can tell them that they can go. But he said also, I go there so I can think about myself and my loss, and especially the loss of my daughter. Here somebody drew me in 2022 a picture of their swing in a brush arbor, and that's where they would grieve and think about their loved ones. One lady talked about it this way. She wrote about her old grief room, and listen to what she said. The room was small when I actually looked at it, not really a place I wanted to spend time. It had no windows. There was a door frame, but no door. When thinking about it, I realized it had shelves with boxes on them. Each box was labeled with a loss. For some reason, the boxes all seemed to be the same size, but in fact, some were heavier than others. The boxes were not really dusty, even though some had been there for many years. The room had no tables or chairs. It was a place of remembrance, but I did not have a desire to spend time in it. I did, however, take a box from this room from time to time and carry it around for a while. I didn't even know I had this room until I came to our grief support group. Then on the other page, she says, my new grief room. Now I made the decision to remodel the room I didn't even know I had. I don't even call it a room now. It's more like a porch. It still has a roof for protection, but there's sun streaming in on all sides. There's a lovely, sweet fragrance that fills the air. A carpet of green grass is all around. There's shelves, but now there are baskets made of spun glass. They're beautiful, but fragile. Each basket holds a loss, but now each loss is wrapped in a blanket of love. I will hold each one carefully from time to time, then give them back to the Father. He knows each one of them, and He holds them in His heart. His timing is perfect. When I am ready, He will help me understand each one of them in time or in eternity. This lady grew, did she not? From her old room that she didn't even know she had to a new room that she picks up from time to time, but then gives back to God. I think that lady's making a journey in her grief. This one was a lady who had lost her son, who was a singer. And so on the mantle are pictures of him, and then in the background, the tape of the son singing, and that being the place where she spent a lot of her time thinking about it. This one has that grief box, the amount of pain that we allow people to see, and it's half open. It shows here being half open. And she only has 2 chairs in her grief room, a big recliner where she sits in and another chair. And on the back, she explains it and explains why. And that big recliner was the one that her husband sat in. And so that's the one that she has there that she sits in. This fellow was very, very smart and intelligent. And yet he had 3 grief spaces in his grief room. The living room for the friend zone where I can openly share my grief. The dining room where we have people sit but we don't know them too well. And then my kitchen is my safe space where I go to be alone because my cooking heals my heart. And so this very smart individual drew that. I like this one because it comes from a child. Katie was age 10 and came to my grief class because she was driving down the road with her granddaddy driving the car or the truck whenever he had a heart attack. She had to grab the wheel because they were about to wreck. And so the granddaddy died. And Katie talks about the chairs for her her friends, and her grief box, and how it's 50-50, allowing people to see some of her pain. And I really thought that was very intelligent for a 10-year-old to come up with a concept like that. This lady really took it seriously. Her husband was a song leader in the Florence area. And she talks about my grief room in the first month. And it's scaled to model. She basically stayed within their bedroom. And she has all the special things, even the tie that he would wear, the last tie he wore to church. And she describes her grief room and her family being there for her and her friends that would call her. This lady has grief friends that are just phone calls away, and they would call sometimes even at midnight. In cancer, they call them your 2 a.m. friends. Who can you call at 2 o'clock in the morning and know that they're willing to listen to you about your pains or your sorrows or your losses? If you can find those 2 a.m. friends. And so she's got pictures here of folks calling at late times of night and such like. This lady described her grief room. She said, there's 3 places I grieve: my front porch swing, my van, and the ocean. I go to my front porch and sit in my swing when I feel emotional, need to be alone, or talk to God. Sometimes I want my husband or my sister to be on the front porch with me, but mostly I like being alone. I do a lot of grieving, thinking, or decision making when I'm alone driving down the road in the van. Maybe that's the reason why I'm not such a good driver. My thoughts are often somewhere else. I love the ocean, especially an ocean uncluttered with tourism. It's just me and the ocean. I feel closer to God at the ocean. Usually I want my husband on the beach with me, but mostly I like being there alone. I never realized that I prefer being alone so much. It seems like if others are there, even people I know and love who love me, I become more concerned about what they think, of what they are thinking or feeling, or try to make them feel better. However, if I ever feel overwhelmed and or discouraged, I don't really feel I can be my true self in front of anyone for very long, except perhaps my husband, my boys, my girls, or my sister. And so she had that idea. I'll end with this one. This one is an American flag. This lady who went to church with us lost her husband after almost 50 years of life. And there was this little table that she had. And on that table are pictures of their family that were very, very important. They would take their family once a year, even their adult children, to Pigeon Forge, to Dollywood. And she'd talk about that on the back page here, what she did and how her husband was such a part of the armed services. And so you see the American flag there. And so she had a little corner for her grief room. I've shown you all these just to say that all of these are different. All these represent different people. And there's so many others. This was a deacon of the church, and after his wife died of dementia, and he took such good care of her, and she was a nurse, he drew this grief room, and it was an entire house. And at the table, which I set out several times to eat with, we'd have hot dogs and chips there several times. And he would, even with the dementia, bring the youth into their home and have us there. And that was so important. But Brother Jimmy would name everyone at the table, and he said basically, my entire house is the place where I grieve the loss of my loved one. And so, we talk about what yours is. You have one, whether you draw it or not. It may be something that you write out or said, but think about your grief room. Again, if your grief was like a room, how big would it be? It's your size, whatever it is. What kind of door would it have on it? Metal door, swinging door? How accessible are you? How much do you want people in your grief journey? It may come at different lengths. At first, you want to be alone, and rightly so. On the other hand, you may want a flood of friends because that's what you need. Again, there's not a right or wrong. What kind of lock would you have on your door? Would you have windows in your grief room? What kind of chairs would you have? How many chairs would you have in your grief room? Would you have one for you and one other? Or would you just have one for you, and if they come in, they're going to have to stand with the idea that I really don't want them there a long, long time? Or would you have a church bench like that lady had, and it's just open to anybody and everybody? There's not a right way. There's not a wrong way. Your homework, if you so desire to do so, is to think about your grief room. Draw it. If you're willing to share it with me for future use, I'd love to do it. Maybe down the road, you might want to do it and send it to me. I had a lady from PTP send me her grief room after I spoke on this subject back in August. Whatever the case is, we all have a grief room. Any questions about that or anything else that we've said so far? We're about to take a short break, and then we're going to finish up so that you can go where you need to go before 12 o'clock, even though I'll stay here as long as I need to. Any questions about the grief room? Do you understand it? Okay, great. Let's take about a 5-minute break and then come back and we'll talk about how do people make it through grief. What are some things that we can do? Thank you so much for your kind attention.